Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Who's the real father of the baby? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy it! Hold on, brother. The commander of the Blades pressed his unshaven cheek against him, then pulled away. He patted his shoulder and tried to look into his eyes. The departing fighters left him a few grenades and full magazines. They shook hands, guiltily avoiding eye contact, understanding that they wouldn't meet him again in this world. Finally, the farewell ended, and the unit, carrying the wounded, departed over the pass. Gyrza still had a lot to do. He started carrying stones and stacking them on the parapet, leaving a loophole sufficient for firing. When everything was done, he pulled his beloved Tonto from its sheath and placed it nearby. He thought for a moment, then did the same with his pistol. He smoked a bit into his sleeve, realizing that it wouldn't change anything anymore, and began to scan the surroundings through binoculars. There was no other road through the pass. They would definitely come here and run into him. Gyrza smirked. Life was crap, maybe the end would be dignified? After half an hour, he noticed scouts. 3 figures, completely unconcerned, almost undisguised, were walking down the path, confident that we had nowhere to run. Gyrza smoothly squeezed the trigger, as he had been taught. A short burst from his rifle broke the silence. 2 of the figures fell as if hitting an invisible barrier. The third one jerked back, shouting something guttural. The enemy took cover and opened intense return fire. Bullets whizzed overhead, striking the rocks and showering him with granite fragments. Gyrza fired single shots, carefully conserving ammunition. But the enemy quickly caught on and dispersed across the terrain, hiding behind large rocks. Their dense suppressing fire kept Gyrza from raising his head. Several lead projectiles hit near the embrasure. Seems they've zeroed in, the thought flickered. Out of the corner of his eye, he managed to catch the bearded figure aiming a grenade launcher at him. Without hesitation, he pulled the ring and the grenade fell next to the bandit. An explosion and silence followed. Gyrza knew it wouldn't last long. Soon, the bandits would recover and regroup. Everything would start anew. I wonder if our guys managed to reach the helicopter. One thing he understood was to hold on as long as things were going smoothly, and most importantly, not to die too early. Otherwise, everything would be in vain. Dusk gradually fell. Here, in the mountains, it grew dark earlier than on the plains. Gyrza could barely distinguish his enemies now. It seemed they were trying to encircle him, hesitating to launch a final attack. Finally, they made their move. The figures started to advance, using short dashes to close in on the trench, gradually tightening the noose. They were less than 100 meters away. Gyrza responded with short bursts, attempting to pin the enemy down behind the rocks. For a while, he succeeded. Eventually, he used up his last grenade. A sharp pain shot through his head, and hot blood streamed down his face. He wiped it away with his palm and lay on his back. He loaded the last magazine. The starry sky gazed down on him indifferently, forming random constellations. Tears welled up in his eyes for some reason. Men don't cry. It's good no one can see him. Gyrza rolled onto his stomach again and pressed against the AKM's sight. One by one, he squeezed the trigger, watching as the enemy diminished. With the loss of blood, his head began to spin, and his strength waned. But he didn't allow himself to relax. When his ammunition ran out, holding a knife in his left hand and a pistol in his right, he rose for one final attack. The helicopter crossed the border, the fighters sat, their backs against the vibrating hull, unsure if Gyrza, covering their retreat, was still alive. But dozens of kilometers away, in the distant mountains, gunshots could still be heard. As soon as I entered the reception area, I caught the secretary's alarmed glance from the corner of my eye. She swiftly sprang up from behind the desk and stood in the doorway, using her chest as a barrier. Samantha asked not to let anyone in. She's very busy. She almost threw her arms out, trying to block my path. Shifting the folder to my left hand, I cautiously gestured towards her well-groomed figure with my right hand. Everything's fine, Veronica. This doesn't concern me. I pressed the handle and pulled the door towards me. My wife quickly stood up from the sofa by the wall, attempting to fasten her blouse. The portly gentleman lounging to her right didn't move an inch, maintaining his insolent smirk as he continued to look at me. Overall, a picture-perfect scene. "John, what are you doing here?" "I told you." She took a deep breath. "Not to let anyone in." I continued for her. "I thought that didn't apply to me." The man by the wall adjusted his jacket and headed towards the door. "Samantha, we can talk later." He triumphantly smiled. "I'll be waiting for your call." The playboy completely ignored me as if I were nobody and left. My wife slumped into the chair. "Why do you barge into my office without knocking?" Samantha tried to regain control of the situation. "You're undermining my authority as the manager. And cozying up to another guy during working hours doesn't undermine your authority?" I was still standing before Samantha, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "By the way, I brought you the quarterly report. Was it absolutely necessary to burst into my office like this?" Samantha was now using her habitual commanding tone. "By the way, I have questions for you. Your performance has dropped by almost half over the last 6 months. I can't tolerate this situation any longer. Such performance calls for dismissal. The best defense is a good offense. Change the topic." Samantha finally regained her composure, realizing that her wimpy husband wouldn't create a scene. "So, what's the matter?" "Fire me then. Should I write a resignation letter on my own, or will you dismiss me under some article?" I started getting angry. "You'll feel freer with your lovers." She blushed. "Get out of here. The dismissal order will be ready today. And don't bother collecting your things. My driver will bring them to you." She rose, boiling with anger. "We'll talk about our future at home." I shrugged and left. After all, I'm a wimp. That's how it should be, being under my wife's thumb and politely smiling at her admirers. Walking past the flustered secretary, I exited the reception area. I didn't have many personal belongings in the office. I quickly tossed them into a box, put on my coat, and headed towards the exit. "Where are you going?" my boss asked me, looking bewildered. "Home. I don't work here anymore," I replied with a polite smile and waved at him. "Wait, John. You have a lot of orders pending. Clients will leave us if you quit." The boss was stammering, trying to hold me back. "It's not a big deal. You can handle it all." I opened the doors and stepped into the corridor. Passing employees looked at me with regret. The news of my dismissal had spread quickly around the office. The plankton had a new topic for discussion. At the security checkpoint, I handed over my access card to the guard and stepped out onto the street, relishing the slightly chilled air of freedom. "Have you gone mad, Samantha? Firing your own husband?" Elena Prokofyevna even jumped on her chair. "And what will your father say?" "Oh, Elena. He won't say anything. I think my dad can see for himself who I married. He's a wimp through and through. Another man would have caused a scene, would have come after Vadim." Samantha's face even reddened from righteous anger. And this one just stands there, eyes on the ground. Mumbles something. Is he even a man? "Samantha, you have children, don't you? Why are you provoking your husband?" The conversation had even made Elena forget about her coffee. "He's a handsome guy. Look, there will quickly be a huntress." "Elena, please. Who needs him?" "Well, I don't know, Samantha. Don't regret it. By the way, are those his children?" Elena Prokofyevna looked at Samantha's face. Samantha remained silent, pretending she hadn't heard the question. Clearly, uncomfortable questions were meant to be ignored. Definitely silly, Elena Prokofyevna thought. Her husband's a gem, always at home, taking care of the kids. Hardly drinks, adores his wife. And she can't find her place. "All right, dear, I should go. There's a lot of work waiting." Elena got up and kissed her friend on the cheek. "Goodbye for now." Samantha's mobile phone started ringing. It was her father. The woman made an annoyed grimace. "Hi, Daddy. How's everything with the contracts?" Did John bring the agreements to you? Her father got straight to the point. By the way, he did a good job. He got Vostov to budge. He's willing to work with us. He just wants John to assess all the risks and contact him tomorrow. Give your husband a treat tonight. Yes, I'm having a small party to celebrate the deal. I'm expecting you and John. We'll have some good meat and wine. Looking forward to it. Her father laughed and hung up. Darn it! Samantha even cursed. She realized that after what had happened in her office, her husband wouldn't accompany her anywhere. His Highness had taken offense. But oh well, wasn't it me who put him under my thumb? She called for her car and, leaving the company to its own devices, headed home to sort out the situation. Going to your father's party? Samantha, are you crazy? Bring your Vadim along, especially since you're parading him around openly. I stood with my back to her, focusedly pouring bourbon into a glass. I looked at the light, admiring the rich color of the drink, and leisurely drank it all, swallowing even the ice chunks. Honestly, I don't understand anything about this beverage, but I had to keep up appearances. John, stop talking nonsense. Vadim is just our partner. There's nothing between us and there can't be. She stumbled, searching for the right word, only love you. Strangely, her words seemed ambiguous to me. Father insisted that we would be there. He wants to talk to you. Samantha kissed me on the lips, simulating an otherworldly passion, and went to get dressed. I stood for a while, thinking, then went into the bathroom, deciding to shave. Passing by our bedroom, through the half-open door, I heard my wife's faint voice. Samantha, trying not to attract my attention, was talking on the phone. Yes, everything's fine. He's incapable of jealousy. Definitely come. We'll have time. She giggled softly. Well, of course, only you. Kisses. I quickly walked into the bathroom. When we arrived, the party was in full swing. It gets dark early in October, so the lawn in front of my father-in-law's house was illuminated by colorful lights. For a while, my wife and I, pretending to be a loving couple, mingled among the guests. Then her mother called Samantha, and I went over to a group of men gathered around the grills. The scent of roasting meat spread across the lawn. I was still far away when I heard a familiar voice. She's quite the babe. We're going to do great things. The brazen Vadim was laughing as he told a story, surrounded by a group of men on the couch. What about her husband? Someone asked. Oh, the husband is a loser, a born cuckold. He'll even hold a candle for us. Vadim exclaimed with satisfaction. You should see that cuckold. I stood behind him and listened intently. She's just the kind of girl we need, the way she makes sounds when she comes. Vadim continued to brag. Yes, that alpha goat. Can't believe Samantha doesn't see who she's gotten involved with. I thought. At that moment, the laughter died down, and everyone turned towards me. Ah, the loser. Vadim teased with a smirk. Where's your little wife? Her mother called her to talk. I stammered, embarrassed. And who are you talking about just now? Her, of course, my dear. Vadim chuckled. But the men around him didn't join in. A menacing silence hung in the air. Vadim was surprised by such a turn of events. He looked at me, but it was too late to back down. He was losing face. Ron, call her here, tell her I'm inviting her. He pushed me in the shoulder. Everything happened very quickly. There was a crunch, and Vadim, awkwardly trying to protect himself with his hand, suddenly fell onto the scorching grill. His right cheek touched the hot metal. The distinct smell of burning flesh filled the air. He lay motionless for a while, his cheeks searing, and then awkwardly fell onto the damp evening grass. A few people rushed towards him, trying to help. In the dim twilight, his bright red cheek was clearly visible. No one understood what had happened. Everyone started shouting at once, "Call an ambulance." I shouted the loudest. Yes, poor Vadim. Instant karma had caught up with him. Two things at once, a broken arm and a seared cheek. I wonder which hand he was holding his glass with. My car, crunching rubber over brick debris, pulled up to the abandoned workshop. I left the party without waiting for the end. Tonight, I decided not to spend the night at home. The bankrupt metal construction plant, which was situated on the outskirts of the city and surrounded by a birch grove, was purchased by me from the city hall for a laughable price. It was solely my acquisition. Neither my father-in-law nor my wife had any idea about my purchase. Only a handful of people knew about the abandoned factory, mostly those who helped me renovate it. Not the entire factory, just the second floor of the assembly workshop. I invested a certain amount and transformed this most preserved building into a fairly comfortable living space. I installed surveillance cameras, monitoring practically the entire perimeter of the plant. I also connected the cameras installed at my home, in the bedroom and the living room. When I set them up, I never thought about my wife's infidelity. I connected them just in case. I had no idea that this case would present itself so soon. I wonder how long she's been fooling around with that idiot. 6 months, a year? Well, what does it matter? The most important thing is to execute my plan and then surprise my beloved wife. Why pity her? So, for now, let's play the fool. The living quarters occupied the entire second floor of the abandoned workshop. I took out a half-empty bottle of vodka from an old refrigerator and poured myself a third of a glass. I skewered a pickled cucumber with a fork. Now that's what I need. Not that stinky Irish moonshine. Pouring another glass, I activated the alarm and reclined on the couch. I needed to rest. Today had been anything but easy. I lived in a happy family for 5 years. Exactly that much time passed until the tragic incident that drastically changed my life for the worse. It was the day when my father died in a car accident. My mother grieved for a short while. It turned out she already had a beloved person for a year and a half. She referred to him as Vasca. We, the children, were twins, a boy and a girl. My mother took Inga, my sister, and left with her new husband, leaving me in the care of my grandmother. I lived with my grandmother, more or less, for 3 years until her death. My mother, dressed to the nines, showed up at the funeral. She quickly sold my grandmother's apartment and sent me to an orphanage. I was 8 years old by then, and I understood perfectly well what was happening. My mother would visit with my sister, who tried her best to keep her distance from me, acting like some princess. I had no desire to show brotherly feelings towards her either. Let the devil take her. I'd tough it out. A memory that stuck with me forever was of a girl chewing candy, dressed like a princess, who called me a beggar. The contempt in her eyes when she tossed a piece of candy at me was unforgettable. Eat up, beggar. Left in the orphanage, my mother and sister quickly vanished. I was left all alone in the world. I won't describe my life, there were ups and downs. But one thing I quickly learned, if you don't protect yourself, no one will. I learned to fight my way through life with my fists. During all my time in the orphanage, my mother never visited me once. It seemed she had better things to do. After finishing the 11th grade, I enlisted in the army. The service came easy to me, so after a year, I entered a military academy. While serving in the military, I had to go through hotspots of the collapsing country and world. During one operation, I was wounded in the head. The wound itself wasn't dangerous, but my face was disfigured. The state funded several plastic surgeries, completely altering my appearance. Even my voice changed, becoming more masculine. When I looked at myself in the mirror after the final surgery, I even liked what I saw. From the fly-ridden mirror, a rugged man who had grabbed life by the horns stared back at me. Maybe that's when the plan formed. A plan of revenge against that heartless and her brood. I didn't know exactly what I would do or how I would get back at them. But I was certain my revenge would be terrible. No, I had no intention of taking anyone's life. I simply wanted to make their existence unbearable, just like mine once was. When my contract ended, I was discharged. They shook my hand, awarded me a medal, and gave me a discharge certificate. And then they promptly forgot about me. By that time, my emotional pain had dulled, and I didn't bother looking for my sister and mother. Let God be their judge. I found a job as a mechanic at a service station. Starting as an apprentice, I became an auto mechanic. The salary wasn't huge, but it was enough. In the fall, I started studying. I enrolled in a technical university. Studying came easily to me, especially with my engineering background. Some subjects were even credited to me. Within a year, I became a master, and after 2 more years, the owner offered me a share in the business. Everything was going well. The rest went as it usually does. At a colleague's birthday party, I met Samantha. She was a sweet, shy girl. Moderately beautiful, moderately delicate. I courted her for almost half a year until, to my surprise, I realized I was in love. To such an extent that I couldn't imagine my future without her. She introduced me to her parents. Her father owned a huge construction company. So, my future wife was used to a comfortable life. I didn't hide the fact that I had spent my childhood moving between orphanages. Her parents frowned, grumbled disapprovingly, but didn't object to their daughter's choice. Before New Year's, we had a wedding. 9 months later, our son was born, and 3 years after that, our daughter. By the time I turned 30, I had become a handsome man. Walking through the city, I caught interested looks from girls and young women. But I loved my wife deeply. More and more as time went on. Funny how that works. The longer you live with someone, the deeper you become entwined with them. I loved my wife to the point where I'd willingly give my life for her. And it wasn't just empty words. Nearly 8 years passed, until I noticed changes in my wife. Everything started to shift at some point. Suddenly, I became a worthless failure, incapable of providing for my family. I worked at the service station, serving as co-owner and deputy director. And my money had always been enough. But now, everything changed. When I came home, the buzz of the sawmill would start, and the psychological manipulation would begin. That's when the abandoned factory entered the picture. I started spending more and more time there. Yet, I still had no inkling of my wife's infidelity. Until one day, I saw it for myself on my monitor's screen. Not only did I see it, but I heard her talking about me. A year ago, her father hired me at his company. That's how I found myself under the direct supervision of his deputy, who was also my wife. She finally put me completely under her thumb. I signed contracts, transferred money, purchased equipment, all while working primarily for myself. I had an incentive. Everyone in that family was worth something to each other. That's when the plan reemerged. And nothing could divert me from my chosen path. I prepared my escape routes with sadistic pleasure, intending to leave destruction in my wake. I enthusiastically played the role of the cuckold, so convincingly that everyone believed it, especially my unfaithful wife. To start, I opened dummy accounts in offshore banks, where I periodically redirected money from my father-in-law's company. Nobody really took me seriously, considering me a total fool. Then, I established a company in another city, where funds from the offshore accounts began to flow. This company remained in the shadows. For a while. A few years after getting married, a fellow soldier offered me an interesting job abroad, in my original field. But I declined at the time because I was at the peak of happiness. He left me his business card, saying that people with my skills and training would always be in demand. When problems with my wife started and I realized there was no turning back, I called the number that was on the gold business card. An appointment was set for me, and within a month, I embarked on my first business trip. At its conclusion, my bank account was significantly boosted. I lived a full life while my wife tangled with her vadim. I couldn't care less about that. I had my own affairs. I frequently disappeared from home, earning illicit money. I was the master of my destiny. And I didn't give a damn about the surrounding reality. I was sick of my love. I suffered enough. I was burned from the inside out. That's what happens when you're constantly trampled on. I won't dwell on female infidelity here. Women come in all sorts. But I ended up with one like that. I don't know what Samantha hoped to achieve by humiliating me in front of her lover, her family, and colleagues. But I have to admit, she did it quite skillfully. I only felt sorry for the children. But ultimately, I wasn't planning to take their lives. So, what happened there? Yevgeny Vasilievich looked at his daughter, sipping his brandy. I don't know, Dad. When I approached, Vadim was writhing in pain on the ground, and everyone around was shouting and calling an ambulance, Samantha said hesitantly, looking at her mother and then shifting her gaze to her father. She had been scared of him since childhood and tried to avoid his eyes even now. Where was your husband? Her father asked sternly. He was there too, as usual, standing on the sidelines. Samantha answered contemptuously. And should he have helped his wife's lover? Yevgeny Vasilievich glared at his daughter. Where? How should I know? Everyone is gossiping about it. You're completely out of your mind. What did you see in that self-satisfied jerk, Vadim? Since when did your husband stop satisfying you? Her father's annoyed voice seemed to hang over them, reaching the high ceiling. Dad! John isn't capable of jealousy. He can't stand up for himself against anyone. I'm telling you. I've studied him during this time. Samantha poured herself some brandy, but didn't drink it. And you studied him. Where's your husband now? Why isn't he beside you? I went to the hospital with Vadim. When I returned, John was gone. Samantha pulled out her iPhone and dialed her husband's number. But his phone was turned off. You see. Her father shook his head in anger. Where is he now? And where does he periodically disappear to? Yevgeny Vasilievich continued, his voice sounding as if it hovered above them, rising to the high ceiling. He takes unpaid leave, or rather, he used to. Samantha looked guiltily at her father. What do you mean, used to? The man raised his head. I fired him. He started getting too bold. Samantha didn't know what to say and tried to grasp at her words. Did you just call yourself an idiot? Samantha lowered her head. Back when you started dating John, I tried to find out about him. You know I have connections. But nobody could find anything. Only one person, working in a very important law enforcement structure, her father raised his finger, told me to stop asking about John. Because it's dangerous. And you tell me he's a pushover. Samantha looked at her father fearfully. I get the impression that my daughter is an incorrigible fool. Yevgeny Vasilievich stood up, his demeanor indicating it was time for Samantha to leave. To Gyrza, it seemed that he heard the roar of a helicopter engine. The sound grew, becoming ever closer. No, it wasn't an illusion. Above his head, blotting out the stars, a predatory, swift bird streaked by. The machine banked sharply and once more headed towards the battle site. Gyrza knew why the pilots hesitated, refraining from opening fire. He extracted a metal tube from his gear, and soon a red rocket launched, marking his position. The helicopter made another circle, and 2 blue arrows detached from its underside. 2 bursts of fire and the thunder of explosions. Fragments of rocky material flew in different directions. Gyrza took cover behind a large stone, sheltering from the flying debris. There were no thoughts in his mind. He lay pressed against the ground, tears streaming from his eyes. He muttered just one word as if on autopilot, ours. Gyrza cautiously poked his head out from cover. The helicopter still circled within visibility, clearly attempting to spot its next target. Before he could determine where the bright lightning had struck towards the rotary wing machine, it was clear. It was easy to see how the missile pierced the hull and became embedded in the plating. Moments later, the sound of an explosion reached Gyrza. The ignited helicopter flung against the rocky plateau, tossed several times before sliding down the slope, breaking apart as it collided with the rocks. Finally, the machine crashed into the gorge, and the echo of a deafening explosion reached him. The question of whether the pilots survived didn't arise. A ringing silence followed, yet Gyrza knew that the enemy was nearby, lying in wait. He tossed a small stone aside. Immediately, a gunshot sounded, and a bullet hit a few meters away, scattering splinters of rock. However, the fighter managed to discern the source of the gunfire. Just then, a cloud covered the moon, casting pitch darkness upon the plateau. Like a snake slipping between the stones, he approached the lurking enemy closely, frozen in place, very much resembling a real Gyrza before a lethal strike. In his right hand, he gripped a tactical knife. It would have been easy, without fuss, to shoot the bandit, but Gyrza wanted to feel the enemy's last breath, his departing soul. Inhaling the cold mountain air deeply, he darted swiftly towards the man lying with his back turned, simultaneously delivering a fatal blow straight into the heart. Gangster had no time to comprehend anything and practically offered no resistance. After restraining the twitching body several times, Gyrza wiped the knife on the enemy's jacket and fell silent. Silence. The moon reappeared, indifferently illuminating the battlefield. Gyrza tilted his head and ran his hand over his neck. Yes, there was blood, but his head didn't hurt, meaning the impact was just a graze, scratches notwithstanding. He got to his feet, adjusted his gear, slipped his hand into the breast pocket of his jacket and found the textured grip of his pistol. Returned the knife to its place. Looked around. Orienting himself using the slightly snow-covered rocks, Gyrza slowly moved down the gentle, albeit occasionally steep, slope. The weather was deteriorating, a gust of cold wind struck. Lead-colored clouds securely concealed the frightened moon, and a fine, annoying rain began to fall. Enveloped in the damp mist, Gyrza pulled his hood over his head and slowly descended into the valley. Suddenly, the deteriorating weather was opportune. In such conditions, Bandit were unlikely to display heightened vigilance, and what vigilance could there be when one can't see a thing just 3 meters away? An alarm clock rang, simultaneously accompanied by the beep of a laptop. An email had arrived. Stretching, I leisurely slid off the couch and glanced at the monitor. All right, the final transaction went through successfully. The funds securely settled in my account. Well, only a little left to go. Bid a fond farewell to my society girl of a wife and her bloodsucker of a father, and smoothly vanish into a new life. These thoughts lifted my spirits. Humming something by the Beatles, I shuffled across the cold floor in my old slippers and entered the bathroom. I stared at myself in the mirror for a while. The question of shaving didn't arise. My 3-day stubble fit well with my loser image. I brushed my teeth and scratched my hairy chest. Really, I looked like a monkey. But women enjoy burying their faces in my curly hair. I don't know what they find appealing about it, but it's their call. I emptied the remains of the expensive cologne onto my closely cropped head. Slipped on a stretched-out undershirt. Returned to the computer. The cell phone next to it was ringing insistently. No worries, the world can wait while I get dressed. I put on a nearly black jacket over the undershirt. Slipped into black jeans. Went to the mirror. A complete image. A loser in all his glory. Good enough. Again, like a wailing siren, the cell phone screeched. John, where have you disappeared to? I've been worried. My wife squawked like a hen fussing over her eggs. Fussing over her eggs. An interesting metaphor, fully reflecting Samantha's essence. What happened? I genuinely couldn't care less about her. In an hour, there's a board of directors meeting. Dad wants you to be there. Guilt-ridden notes crept into Samantha's voice. Hope you haven't forgotten that I don't work at your company. I even yawned. She's so predictable. Darling, I'm not serious. Samantha rushed to chatter, as if afraid I'd hang up. I'll think about it. I disconnected. I settled into the car and calmly drove off the factory premises. I needed something to eat. I stopped at a small cafe forgotten by the Ministry of Food Industry. The neon sign was missing 2 letters, giving the place a mysteriously glamorous touch. I pushed the entrance door open and was engulfed in the characteristic aroma of a public eatery. The plump waitress, lost in her thoughts, took my order, and I settled in a corner, waiting for my coffee. But before I could fully immerse myself in the ambience, the annoying phone buzzed. John, a woman called you multiple times. She asked for your mobile number. The department secretary, where I dedicatedly worked until recently, spoke in a well-modulated voice. Who's the woman? What demands is she making? I almost laughed. Victoria Chikina. She says it's regarding a personal matter. There was curiosity in the secretary's voice. Give her my mobile. My mood had soured. The woman's surname meant nothing to me. But her first name. Upon entering the boarding school, I found myself in a different world. Wonderland. One against all. I was beaten whenever there was a chance, without bothering with reasons. Nights were particularly tough. I genuinely feared sleep. They would often organize dark sessions for me. They would throw a blanket over me and hit me wherever they pleased. Asking for protection from the teachers or supervisors was useless. Gradually, the spring of my character tightened. One day, during recess, they dragged me into an empty classroom and began their disciplinary session. But something went wrong. I pulled out a shiv I had crafted from an old file during the manual labor class and swung with all my might, hitting one of the disciplinary staff in the thigh. Blood gushed out like from a pig. I struck another in the shoulder. The shiv went in up to the hilt. The opponent groaned something and dropped out of the action. Dealing with the third was quite simple. I kicked him in the crotch with the heel of my heavy government-issue boot. He screamed a stream of profanities and clutched his groin with both hands. I knocked him to the floor and began methodically kicking him, trying to aim for his face. Teachers rushed in at the sound of the cries and witnessed a scene worthy of a horror movie. A pool of blood and a screaming imbecile. After that, things got interesting. Police, stern men and women. But they couldn't manage to put me behind bars. Too young. They gave me a stern talking to and let me off. They even let me stay at the boarding school. The reputation of being a psycho stuck with me. They left me alone, and I began to live as if in space, not interacting with anyone. There was an intriguing character at the boarding school who worked as a watchman and janitor. He wore a camouflage jacket and had a prosthetic leg instead of his left. But he wasn't disheartened. Merrily humming something, he swept the schoolyard, serving as the night watchman. He lived at the boarding school in a tiny basement room. Alone. That's who I connected with. He would enthrall me with stories about his life. About Africa, about exotic countries he had visited. I listened to him with my mouth agape. But as I grew up, I began to doubt. It seemed to me that my adult friend was pulling the wool over my eyes. Nevertheless, I would still go to his room in the evenings. We'd brew tea, and he'd tell me another story. He never talked about his personal life. Sometimes, in the middle of a story, he would fall silent for a few minutes. His face would become stern, his cheekbones would sharply stand out, and my friend would become somewhat alien, unfamiliar. Then it would pass, and he'd return to his usual state. Once, during one of those moments, he said to me, "Remember, kid, for a man, honor is paramount. Don't be afraid of defeat. It's temporary. You'll have your time. But if you lose your honor, you'll never get it back. No matter how hard you try. And remember, there are concepts like love and loyalty. They're not separate things. Love is loyalty. There's no love without loyalty." My friend sighed and began telling something cheerful. He died when I was in my final year. They buried him with little pomp at the military cemetery. They fired shots over the grave and played the anthem. Silent people in military uniforms stood around, sternly looking at the grieving woman in black. I distinctly remember the little pillows with numerous medals and the ceremonial cap pinned to the lid of the coffin. An hour later, Gyrza emerged onto a barely noticeable mountain trail. After walking a few dozen meters, he decided to take a break when he heard the sound of footsteps and someone's conversation around the bend. A group of people were coming along the trail, and he realized that besides the bandits, no one else could be walking here. Gyrza pulled out his Stechkin and took a step aside, but it was too late. They spotted him. There were 4 of them. 3 seemed to be locals. 2 were around 20 years old, the third a bit older, presumably their leader. The fourth, or rather the fourth person, dressed in rags through which one could see a long-neglected body with hands tied behind her back, was being led on a rope looped around her neck. They stopped, exchanging bewildered glances upon seeing an unfamiliar man in faded camouflage. "Stop," ordered the eldest. He was about 5 meters away, standing with his left side facing Gyrza, an automatic rifle held against his chest. The other 2 stood a bit farther back, clearly relying entirely on their commander. Gyrza squeezed the trigger twice. The 9mm bullets penetrated the mujahideen's coat. He was thrown backward, dropping his rifle, which clattered against the rocks. One of the young men spun around and was thrown to the side. He fell face down across the pedestrian path, choking on his own blood. The bullet had hit his throat. Girza raised his pistol again and fired several shots. One of the bullets hit the mujahideen between the eyes. Girza lowered his pistol and searched for the bound woman with his eyes. "Come here," he beckoned with his right hand, which still held the gun. "Come, don't be afraid." She cautiously approached. It was evident that she was shivering with fear and cold. But it seemed she was more afraid of disobeying orders. Girza hid the gun in his jacket pocket and pulled out a knife. "Turn around," he said, quickly cutting the ropes. "Who are you?" She recoiled back, as if expecting a blow, and remained silent. Maybe she didn't understand English. I recognized the woman immediately. Mother had not changed at all. The same well-groomed face with a perpetual expression of discontent. A slender body, bronzed from the efforts of masseuses. She paused and scanned the hall in search of me. "Mom, I'm here." I stood up from the table and raised my hand. "John," she said skeptically, peering at my face. "You've changed so much." Apparently, my appearance disappointed her. Her eyes caught my t-shirt and jeans. "What do you want from me?" I cut to the chase, skipping pleasantries. "John." My mother took out a handkerchief and wiped away tears. "Wow, she can cry?" "Jean is very sick. She urgently needs a bone marrow transplant." My mother looked at me with teary eyes. "Only you can help her. She needs your biomaterial. I beg you, please help." She was almost sobbing. For some reason, I remembered the girl in the revealing outfit, disdainfully tossing a candy at my feet, and the indifferent back of her mother behind the closing door of the boarding school. I couldn't think straight. I stood up silently and left the cafe. The door of my Lexus closed quietly. The shocked expression on my mother, who had followed me outside, was the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror of my car. Girza picked up the mujahideen's rifle. He looked around. Another rifle was lying a little to the side. He pulled it by the strap and took it in his hands. He detached the fully loaded magazine. He pulled the bolt several times. It cycles smoothly. He removed the top cover of the receiver. The spring and gas piston were lubricated. Apparently, this AKM hadn't been fired in a long time. Girza attached the cover and magazine back in place. He pulled 2 more loaded magazines from the pouches of the commander lying on his back and put them into his pouch. "Should be enough." He looked at the woman. She was sitting crouched down, afraid to move. Girza took out a chocolate bar. "Eat." Then, after a moment's thought, he took a warm jacket from one of the bandits and threw it to the woman. "Put it on," he said. She obediently put on the jacket. They needed to leave quickly. Gunshots in the mountains can be heard from far away. Perhaps a group of armed men is rushing here to seek revenge. Girza slung the rifle over his shoulder and gently nudged the reluctant companion. "Let's go." He thought that the rebels probably didn't walk all the way on foot. Most likely, they came by car. That means there's a road somewhere below. And most likely, their vehicle is hidden there as well. They probably bought or stole the woman and were taking her to their village. The customs here are simple to the point of madness. Might makes right here, and whoever has the gun is right. After half an hour, they reached the road. On one side, the road pressed against the cliffs, while on the other side, the sound of a mountain river echoed from the depths of the gorge. As they approached, a white Toyota with rust spots was parked near the cliffs. The doors were open, and the key was still in the ignition. Just as it should be. Who would fear theft here? Everyone is kin, everyone knows each other. Girza plopped down in the front seat, throwing the rifle to the back. He swung open the right door. "Get in," he motioned to her. He hadn't figured out if she understood English, but she followed his command correctly. The woman obediently sat in the front seat. Girza started the engine, turned the car around, and headed toward what he believed was a government military checkpoint. It became pitch dark, but Girza didn't rush to turn on the headlights. The moon occasionally emerged from behind the clouds, dimly illuminating the road. The car was moving slowly. He felt as if he was creeping along, ready for any unexpected events. They drove for a while. Gradually, dawn began to break. Instead of the nighttime darkness, a sticky gray fog enveloped the road. Girza stopped the car and opened the door, listening carefully. A dog was barking somewhere up ahead. Most likely, there's a settlement there. Usually, a checkpoint is located at the entrance. He needed to leave the car and proceed on foot. Girza gestured to the woman, indicating that she should get out of the car. Then, he grabbed his rifle and started walking along the road. He didn't look back, knowing that the woman wouldn't lag behind. Visibility was almost zero, and he stumbled over a concrete slab lying across the road. Clearly, a checkpoint was ahead. He shouted a few times, hesitating to fire. Who knows, they might open fire recklessly. Someone responded to him in the local language. He remembered a few words and managed to explain who he was. Two soldiers appeared out of the fog, each armed with rifles. Girza placed his AKM on the concrete and raised his hands. At that moment, a loud thud sounded behind him, something heavy and hot struck his back. For Girza, everything around him plunged into a viscous, sticky darkness. A knock sounded on the compartment door. "We're arriving." The voice of the conductor seemed to echo right by his ear. Girza opened his eyes. The suburbs of a big city had already begun outside the window. It was nearly dawn. Raindrops, smeared by the wind and speed, danced in a circle on the glass. There was no one else in the compartment. The fellow passengers had probably disembarked during the night. Girza squinted and smiled. The doors of the neighboring compartments slammed shut. Girza dressed leisurely, fastened his prosthetic leg, picked up his bag of belongings, looked around to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything, and stepped out into the narrow corridor of the sleeper car. The train slowly pulled under the glass roof of the old station. Finally, with a slight jolt, it came to a stop. The conductors quickly lowered the steps and wiped the handrails. People slowly started emerging from the train cars. Girza descended onto the platform, holding onto the handrails and limping slightly as he made his way toward the exit. A chilly northern wind blew and sent a heap of yellow fallen leaves swirling toward him. Suddenly, Girza felt an inexplicable unease, as if the wind wanted to warn him about something. He flicked his cigarette butt into a bin and, slightly limping, headed toward the bus stop. Girza climbed up to the 4th floor and used his key to open the apartment door. The murmurs of a television could be heard from somewhere deep inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Girza took off his bag and walked into the kitchen. 2 cups with unfinished coffee stood on the table. For a moment, it seemed as if Vera would walk into the kitchen any second now, and everything would be as it used to be. From the bedroom, Girza heard a rustling noise. He cautiously cracked open the door and froze at the sight. His wife was on her knees in front of a without clothes, unfamiliar man, moving her head rhythmically. A picture-perfect scene, as Comrade Gosman used to say. The man placed his hand on the back of Vera's head, setting the right rhythm and controlling her movements. He sat with closed eyes, his chin lifted in a blissful sound. Vera was fully engrossed, giving herself entirely to her beloved activity, smacking and slurping with enthusiasm. It was a vivid example of a strong, gender-blind partnership between 2 understanding partners. Girza stood there for a while, observing the erotic scene with interest. Then he returned to the corridor, rummaged through his bag, pulled out a flashbang grenade, and carefully approached the bedroom. He didn't hesitate for a moment. There were enemies in the bedroom, and they had to be treated as enemies. Girza extended the fuse and pulled out the pin. He cracked the door slightly and tossed the grenade toward the bed. Lost in their oral ecstasy, the partners paid no attention to him. Girza managed to close the door just in time before a loud bang echoed, followed by a blinding flash. After a moment, a piercing male scream could be heard. When Girza returned to the bedroom, he saw Vera lying unconscious on the floor with the severed dignity of her lover in her mouth. She always had good teeth. Girza thought with a touch of pride. The lover himself, clutching his bloodied groin with his hands, was crumpled near the bed, groaning loudly. Oblivious to his surroundings, he hadn't yet recovered from the shock of pain. Gyrza, careful not to step on the bloody stains, picked up the remains of the grenade, walked back to the corridor, retrieved a guitar from the closet, a gift from his mother, grabbed his bag, and quickly left the apartment. When he got into a taxi, he was confident that no one had seen him. 6 months after my friend's funeral, I was summoned to the director's office at the orphanage. Vikiny Pavlovich chewed his lips for a long time, then turned to a stranger sitting at a small table. "This is John, the one himself." The director stood up and left me alone with the stranger. "Well, hello there, the one himself, John." He extended his hand toward me. The handshake was firm, manly. "I'm called, but who cares what my name is?" The man smirked. "Yura asked me to pass this to you." He pulled a guitar case from behind the chair and then placed a set of keys on the table. "These are for the motorcycle in the garage. Here are the documents." The stranger pushed a leather wallet toward me. "You'll figure it out." Then he took a plastic card out of his breast pocket. "These are some funds. Count them when you can. The PIN code is 4 ones. The man stood up. "Don't grieve, everything will be fine for you." He patted me on the shoulder and left the office. When I arrived at my father-in-law's company office, I clung to the hope that I wouldn't be allowed in. However, I was met by the head of the security department himself, who promptly escorted me to the conference room. As I entered, the whole gang was already gathered. My father-in-law looked at me with disapproval but didn't say a word. I took a seat by the wall, displaying an air of indifference to those assembled. After all, I was not a member of the board of directors in any way. And until then, I had no idea what the hell they wanted from me. The main agenda of the board of directors meeting was the transfer of company management to my wife, Samantha. Her father retained control over the company but was handing a portion of the shares to his daughter. No one took me into account. My opinion wasn't considered. After a while, everyone dispersed, leaving only my wife and father-in-law. "John, it's time to talk." My father-in-law got straight to the point. "You saw that I handed over the company to Samantha. She wants to appoint Vadim as the manager. You know him. It's her prerogative. She wants a divorce from you. I understand you have 2 children, but there's nothing to be done. You will pay child support and participate in their upbringing as best you can." My father-in-law glanced at Samantha. She sat silently, not turning her head in my direction. "So, that's how it is. Fine. I don't think there will be a problem with raising the children." I placed 2 documents with imposing coat of arms stamps in front of my father-in-law. "What's this?" He picked them up and attempted to read. "The results of DNA paternity tests. None of the children are mine. It's probably best if their biological father takes care of raising them." I looked pointedly at Samantha. "Is that Vadim, dear?" She flinched at the question and blushed. "I filed for divorce. You'll be left with nothing, with your backside bare. My lawyers will bleed you dry, like a leech." My wife's pretty face contorted with a grimace. She was nearly shouting with anger. As if waiting for the right moment, 2 young men entered the conference room. "These are our lawyers, they will handle the divorce." My father-in-law wiped his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief, as if he had been fearing something all this time. Damn, they surrounded me from all sides. I tried to contain my emotions. "Mr. Lehman, your spouse has filed a petition for divorce and property division. If you wish, you can invite your own lawyer," one of the young men smirked. "So be it." He continued, "We represent your wife's interests in her divorce case against you. We thought maybe we can reach some private settlement instead of battling it out in court. Are you absolutely sure you don't want to bring your lawyer?" "Why bother? I have no intention of contesting anything," I said, looking at my father-in-law. Poor guy, he broke into a sweat. I don't get what he's afraid of. The lawyer took a voice recorder out of his briefcase. "Would you mind if I record our conversation?" I didn't mind, but I immediately pressed the button on a small device in my pocket. "Let's determine your assets, Mr. Lehman." The lawyer looked at my wife. "According to your wife, you have 2 cars, a bike, the house where you live with your wife and children, as well as bank accounts. The bike and the house were mine before the marriage, I tried to speak calmly. We're aware of that, but over the years of cohabitation, your wife contributed money for the motorcycle's repair and, correspondingly, for the house. There are corresponding documents for this. The lawyer handed me a pile of receipts. Oh, Samantha. She thought of everything. So she had decided to cheat me long ago. The thing is, neither the house nor the bike are mine. They belong to a friend. I'm merely using them. Your wife believes that both the house and the bike belong to you. At least you never claimed otherwise over the years of your shared life. What she thinks doesn't matter much. I thought for almost 15 years that she loved me too. And look where that got me. Concealing assets is a crime. The lawyer took off his glasses and began wiping them. I suppose you've checked the house and the bike and confirmed that they belong to someone else. A friend of my friend, who kindly allows me to live in his house and ride his motorcycle. Can you name the owner? Unfortunately, I don't know it. But I would advise against bothering him too much, he's quite nervous. I looked sympathetically at the lawyers. All right, but can you confirm the presence of the cars? The lawyer was losing his self-assurance right before my eyes. If my dear wife had bothered to check, she would have found that I don't own a single car. They all belong to the Special Forces Veterans Association. I just use and maintain them. Nevertheless, we would like to clarify more precisely. Who do your cars belong to? My eyes turned to ice. I stared at the lawyer for a moment. Do you really want answers to your questions? I asked coldly. The room fell silent. The lawyer looked questioningly at my father-in-law. It seems this idiot got too carried away. I wouldn't advise prying into the association with such questions. They don't take too kindly to the overly curious. I smiled kindly. My father-in-law hung his head, looking at the floor. It seemed to me that he was beginning to understand something. Remember that our conversation is being recorded? One of the lawyers picked up the voice recorder, rewound the tape, and pressed play. White noise emanated from the built-in speaker. I took a small box out of my pocket. Quite a convenient device. It jams all video and audio devices within a 50-meter radius. I found it amusing and looked at Samantha. You won't get anything, dear. I wouldn't rush into court if I were you. There's still a particle of love for you left in me somewhere, but if I were in your shoes, I'd try my best to avoid crossing paths with me again. I looked at my sweaty father-in-law. I'm leaving, and I recommend leaving me alone. Don't create problems for yourselves. I stood up and headed for the exit. But as I approached the door, 2 security guards stepped in. For some reason, I wasn't surprised. Life doesn't teach fools anything. Before anyone could react, 2 young guards almost simultaneously collapsed to the floor, knocking down a pair of chairs in the process. Who else wants to take the risk? I scanned those around me. It seemed no one was eager. Catching a surprised and shocked look from Samantha, I swiftly made my way towards the elevators. Idiots, I can already imagine their faces tomorrow morning when they discover their empty accounts. I brushed off the leaves carried by the wind. Carefully, I placed a bouquet of scarlet carnations on the black granite slab. The cemetery was quiet, even the autumn wind seemed to make an effort not to disturb the departed. I couldn't leave without saying goodbye to my friend. For a while, I stood there silently, gazing at the marble obelisk with a star through tearful eyes. Men cry too. Rest in peace, brother. May the earth be soft for you, Gyrza. The motorcycle started with a half-turn, and soon the gray ribbon of the road was rolling under its wheels. Fields, freshly harvested, and the green forest with patches of red and yellow leaves rushed past on both sides. I knew exactly where I was headed. The path was one, towards the sun. PSA donation of $10 million has been made to the Republican Children's Oncology Clinic. The name of the sponsor could not be determined. What do you think of our story today? To me it was an interesting and ambiguous story that I won't be able to forget for a long time. What is your opinion and impression of today's story? Write in the comments. Until new videos.